Chapter 13. Moving on. Keeping clean was an arduous business. Continual perspiration, the constant handling of firewood, the reddish dust from the terribly dry soil, and contact with some strange bushes whose trunks were covered with a layer of soot, all conspired against it. Our sores were still a nuisance to us. They had been added to by other injuries, which at first were mere scratches from thorns or superficial cuts. It was when we went for our daily bath that they troubled us most. If we washed in a backwater of the cold stream, the small fishes that teemed there went for the sore places and tore the flesh painfully. If we sought a torrent in order to elude the fish, the beating of the water against the wounds opened them again. One day we decided to spend the morning beside the brook. The program was to be a varied one. We were to begin with a bath, and then wash our clothes, have lunch, and take full advantage of the arabesque of sunshine and shade woven by the trees. We were surprised to see very few Indians. After our frugal lunch, we were just about to return to our hut when 3 girls appeared, each about 16 years of age, returning from a successful collection of palmitos. They invited us to share them, and while they were bathing, Norma showed them how to use soap, using one of our last remaining tablets for the purpose. Then a distant shouting told us that something important was going on, and we were far away from it. To our excited questioning, the girls replied, "Buriti." We left our containers of water by the stream and hurried to the village, complaining to each other of the savants' thoughtlessness in not warning us about the ceremony. Several groups of 10 to 15 Indians were heading for the jungle at a trot, painted as we had never seen them before. Some had broad black stripes running across their backs and trunks painted with a mixture obtained from a fruit called papo. Others had the same kind of stripes in red, uricum, and there were some whose stripes combined both colors. They all had their hair tied in a ponytail, and they were wearing strange belts fastened behind with a long tuft of fibers from the palm buriti, plaited and bound with red. As I rushed from the hut with the sign camera, the chief stopped me, told me to take off my shirt, put a necklace and one of the strange belts upon me, and sent me off to join the warriors. With pride I followed the line of Indians and willingly left the filming to Norma. When they saw that I was with them, the warriors stopped and surrounded me. One of them put another necklace on me, another took off a very ornamental belt and exchanged it for mine, and all of them seemed delighted that I was taking part. Is there, I wonder, anything peculiar about my hidden personality, that somewhere deep inside I was rejoicing at throwing aside our sophisticated civilization in exchange for the sincere exuberance of these tribes? We walked and ran for about a couple of miles. There we found awaiting us 6 formidable-looking green trunks of the buriti palm. I did not dare to attempt lifting one of them in case I made myself look ridiculous. Later, when I was alone, I did so. They must have weighed 150 pounds apiece. The 6 groups, or teams, one for each trunk, joined one another, and at a shouted signal, one warrior of each team shouldered a tree trunk and ran off with it swiftly as if it were no more than a feather. The air was filled with yells and shouts of encouragement and thunderous footfalls. I ran too, close behind the Indians. When one of the savants flagged, he passed the tree trunk to another of his team without pausing. So the race went on, losing nothing of the original momentum. I was left puffing and blowing farther and farther behind. As the ground was sandy, I kicked off my shoes and carried them in my hand. I exerted all my will in an effort to keep up with the runners. My breathing became labored, and my heart was pounding like a beating drum. Norma welcomed me with a warm embrace and informed me that my team had come in first with its burriti. Exhausted with the cuts on my feet, open and bleeding again, the sight that met my eyes gave me an incentive to accept an invitation to a fraternal dance for the competitors, arranged so as to obviate the possibility of hard feelings after the race. Nearly all the warriors who had taken part in the sport had deep, bleeding wounds on their left shoulders as a result of the pressure and friction of the heavy trunks. Now I understood why members of these tribes commonly have a deformity of the left collarbone. Almost overcome with fatigue, I joined in the next part of the ritual in a daze. Then we all went off for a bath. No wonder the name of Zavant is associated in civilized regions with all that is ferocious and brutal. That night we enjoyed a meal of palm shoots and young coconuts as a celebration of the Zavant's virile sport called burriti. In the tribal meetings there was no talk this time about hunting, gathering of fruit, or a projected advance. The events of the evening, seasoned with wholesome chaffing and discussion, kept the warriors' minds fully occupied. Taking care of the camera and lens and trying to shield them from dust was an unrewarding task. To preserve a delicate instrument in our condition was quite a feat, the more so since that complicated mechanism accompanied us wherever we went. The exposed films I wrapped in tinfoil and enclosed in sheets of aluminum to shield them from the heat, and then I placed them in a hole which I dug in the floor of the hut, together with the snake bite serum. Within the sphere of science and anthropology, our sporadic and difficult filming represented something of particular importance, for the customs of these tribes were almost wholly unknown, and no one had even succeeded before in taking moving pictures of them. Attempts to provide material for the annals of the Indian Protective Service had been a failure. Notwithstanding the praiseworthy self-sacrifice of the service's photographer, Sir Enrique, according to the personal assurance I was given on the subject, this intrepid official endeavored to take shots from the River of the Dead up to his waist in the water using a powerful telescopic lens of a hunting party from the parent village, but owing to the distance between himself and the Zavants, his professional zeal was frustrated, and therefore I could be relatively well satisfied with what I filmed. On the other hand, from the purely personal point of view, I regarded the camera as my enemy. Number one, when it came to trying to win the goodwill of the Zavants. The acute and intelligent mentality of the warriors had a certain incontestable logic about it. Why did I always carry the camera with me if it did not provide me with food or drink? And why did I have to point it at them as though it were a weapon? What was the sound it made as of the tail of a rattlesnake? If only I had means of developing the pictures I had taken to prove to them that what I told them was true. So every attempt to take shots of them met with emphatic refusal. The scenes I took with women and children in them I obtained through Norma's patient and affectionate persuasion. Others I got by chance, or more often by orders of the chief or the friendliness of certain influential warriors and captains. I never tried to force the issue, and I believe that my attitude of patient resignation was what, after all, enabled me to obtain a fairly complete film record of the life and customs of this people, in spite of having lost 1/3 of it owing to the effects of the climate and the long time I had to wait before the pictures could be developed. The dry season was undergoing a transformation. The temperature no longer fluctuated abruptly between 122 and 59 Fahrenheit. Now it remained steady at between 113 and 122 in the daytime, to fall between 68 and 77 at night. The sun did not rise in a clear, cloudless sky, but was shrouded in mist. Not until noon did the day acquire its full brilliance, and then the blazing sun burned us even in the shade. Norma brought me the news. Indians, also savants, who seemed to be strangers, were talking to Sirupre and several captains at the western approach to the camp. It was impossible to make any serious conjectures as to whether they had come far. They had recently spruced themselves up and were freshly painted, as befitted savant warriors when on a visit to their brothers. In a submissive attitude they endured to the severe inspection, all except one, short and stocky, and pointed ears and shaven head. When he addressed Sirupre, he did not lower his eyes or show timidity. After a number of preliminaries, he accompanied Sirupre and some of the captains to the village, while the warriors who had come with him remained at the entrance to the camp. When I saw the beautiful multicolored feathers of their bundles of arrows, I remembered Ureta and Saure. The visitors had also brought little mameries containing small coconuts and baskets of meat. They squatted on the ground and answered all the questions that were put to them. When Sirupre returned, the visiting warriors went back to the village and with him, and each of them was received into one or other family of the tribe, according to the orders of the captain. We had witnessed the arrival of the famous chief Babati and his escort. The chief's village was situated some 200 miles from Zavantina, behind a range of mountains we had been able to make out only on clear days. It was estimated that his village, judging by the number of huts counted in an aerial reconnaissance, comprised some 600 persons, 200 less than the parent village. No white man had ever set foot in it. That night I was given a place in the council of elders. I imagined this was to satisfy Babati, who looked at me with misgivings. The council referred to Babati and the great hunting trips he had undertaken. I had the impression that for the first time in my experience diplomacy was supplanting sincerity, and the elders of the parent tribe had no intention of conveying their future plans to their lesser blood brother. The same prudence extended to the warriors of Babati's escort. They were treated hospitably and invited to partake of the sparse supply of meat. They were presented with arrows and mats, but they were watched over by the families with whom they lodged and not permitted to build a hut for themselves. I expected them to have no more to do with us than was absolutely unavoidable, as the other savants had done. However, Norma made a profound impression. They never imagined we could understand what they were saying, and so they made no attempt to be guarded in their conversation. Norma won first prize because her skin was so white and because she was so well groomed, hair neatly combed and face carefully painted. Possibly she was the first white woman they had ever seen, but they did not consider her beautiful. She was too slim, ill-nourished, and gave the impression of not having sufficient strength and stamina for transporting heavy loads. Surprise and sudden shock caught me once more unawares. I could hear loud explosions and whistling sounds all over the village. I finished pulling my clothes on my clothes and rushed out of the hut. From the fire, sparks were jumping, and objects leapt into the air. Hollowed gourds of all sizes were being burnt. Some, as the air in their hermetically sealed interiors heated, emitted a whistling sound. Most of them exploded violently. My surprise knew no bounds when I observed that the huts were empty. Only the chief and a captain were putting together some bundles of arrows preparatory to departing. When he caught sight of me, the chief asked me why I was not ready to leave. I told him in no uncertain manner that we were not ready because he had not informed me of what was going on. My irritation must have been very evident, which only made him laugh. He slung the arrows over his shoulder, and grasping his bow and spear, told me casually that when the sun would be in a certain place, after the moon went down, in one day's time, his warriors would come for me. Without a word or gesture of consolation, he turned on his heel, and he and the captain set off for a new destination, which had been marked out for his tribe. Without food, lost in the immensity of the Mato Grosso, we could give ourselves up for dead, if the chief's promise should prove vain. An all-embracing silence covered the village. After a while, the wheeling and fluttering of vultures broke the silence with their gruesome din. The great black birds took possession of the site, and in their search for food, dared to approach within a few yards of us. Not admitting to each other the fears that beset us, we maintained an outward calm. We went from hut to hut, Norma searching for food that might have been left behind, while I looked for some utensil or weapon of ethnological interest. The heat made us cut short our search. My wife found some boxes of matches, still in use, which we had given as presents, and quite a number of green coconuts, while I came across a piece of quartz and a bow without a string. We packed our equipment in case they came for us. We did not dare to touch upon that topic. We well knew from the aerial view the formidable appearance of the virgin jungle, never ending, never changing. One did not need much imagination to visualize what it would be like to attempt to set out from where we were, having only the sun to guide us. We cooked the beans and placed the coconuts by the fire to make them ripen. We went to bathe and fetch water. For the first time we took firearms with us. The presence of the vultures might attract the big cats. I did the best I could to behave naturally, but the truth was I had a lump in my throat, of disillusion perhaps. Refreshed, we returned to the hut. I have never been able to recall the sensations I experienced at the time. It did not occur to me to record them, but I would never wish to go through it again. We ate the beans and we set to work to open the nuts. This was a most laborious undertaking, for the machete was useless, and the only way we found of breaking the extraordinarily tough shells was by striking them with a stone while supporting them on another concave in form. We depended upon the word of a human being considered a savage, and although we ourselves had confidence in his promise, there was no getting away from the fact that this confidence misplaced meant starving to death. Would I be able to find my way to the river of the dead? Would I ever reach it anyway? I did not believe I could. The jungle presented so many similar characteristics that it was almost certain I would lose my way. Perhaps I could follow the track the Indians had left in their march. I went up to the clump of trees beyond which I had seen the chief and captain vanish, and I examined the ground. I could not find a single footprint. The clayey soil, hardened by the dry weather, showed no trace that human feet had trodden it. The shadows of the huts became more and more elongated until they became confused in the darkness. That was the signal for the vultures to fly up to the roofs of the huts, and, folding their enormous wings, settle themselves for the night. In the daytime the silence could be heard, at night it could even be felt. The lugubrious fluttering of the big bird's wings, which at first we had found disagreeable, now kept us company. In the half-light the village looked huge. We found ourselves waiting for the song of the evening to begin, and the chanting of the councils. The breeze that springs up at that hour, bringing with it the nocturnal coolness, offered us no consolation. As it filtered through the leaves and branches of the huts, it caused a gentle hissing sound which only made us more miserable. It was interesting to note how the mind played us up, and how some mystical stage hand seemed to have shifted the familiar scenery around so that it had suddenly become depressingly uncanny. We had very little supper. By now our bartering for coconuts and maize had become a daily affair, and the exodus of the tribe, having taken us unawares, had left us unprovided for. Neither Norma nor I made any reference to the possibly desperate plight we were going to find ourselves in. It was not that we were afraid to do so, but that life in the jungle had accustomed us to relying upon the very jungle to support us like some sort of utopia, with always something for tomorrow that had nothing to do with present reality. Reality was depressing enough. What was the point of adding to our troubles by letting our thoughts dwell on what might happen? But for my own part, I could never quite manage to embrace the absolute indifference to adversity that a philosophy of fatalism is supposed to engender. Our fire, the only point of light in the immensity of the primeval night, blinked bravely until we took refuge in our feeble hut to doze fitfully until morning. It was about noon the following day when I spurred into attention by Norma's evident agitation. I followed her gaze. Between the huts, almost at our side, there were advancing toward us a single file, a party of warriors fully armed. Norma did not recognize them and jumped to the conclusion that they were Indians with hostile intentions. They were certainly savants. At the sight of them, an indescribable feeling of relief swept over me. All my fears were forgotten. Out of sheer curiosity, I observed the position of the sun. It was at the very point of the sky to which the chief had referred. We finished arranging the equipment and packing it in such a way as to be most easily carried by the warriors, with ropes tied to the two ends of the sack so that they could be partly supported by their foreheads. I was surprised to see that 7 warriors had come instead of 5, and that the other 2 went ahead along the trail, their bows at the ready. The warriors, all young men, set off at a rapid pace, far too fast for Norma. As they showed no signs of slackening, I let them get a long way in front, and we came on behind slowly. As we turned a bend, we found them waiting for us, obviously irritated by the delay. Then I went up to the leader of the group, and I told him firmly that unless they walked more slowly, we would not follow them. This had the desired effect. The chief's order about our safety must have been categorical, for from that moment on the march assumed a manageable pace, although the descending sun scorched us even through our pith helmets. The path led across sandy desert, past clumps of emaciated trees, stunted vegetation, burnt black in fires caused by the all-consuming heat, or through intricate labyrinths of bushes and trees which furnished us with occasional stimulating respite of cool shade. When we came to a clear stream, we took our boots off, and shedding our cartridge belts and revolvers, we bathed with all our clothes on, including our hats, and drank eagerly of the pure cold water. We bathed alone in accordance with his code of rules. The savant may not allow himself any comforts during the prosecution of a mission. The warriors laughed at us and with us, and from then on their anger at having to walk slowly dissipated, even though their bodies had not profited by the refreshing water, and were gleaming with perspiration. There was a jaguar leaning against the trunk of a tree, the only tree in that part of the undergrowth. The animal was a bloody mass covered with insects. Its bones were broken, its head smashed in, and there were great rents in its belly. 2 broken arrows were still projecting from its left shoulder. It had been killed when the savant warrior scouts had passed that way to blaze a trail for the rest of the tribe. Now I understood why there were 2 extra Indians at the head of our column. They knew that the jaguar did not prowl alone. Norma and I felt sorry for the beast. It seemed sad that such a majestic creature should have met such an ignominious end. We walked for some 6 hours. The sun was just setting when we caught the smell of burning wood. The warriors put down the equipment, and we continued our way up a sloping field of thick grass. When we reached the top of the incline, we came upon the camp. With the family huts built in the classic semicircle, It was just as though the panorama of the previous camp had been miraculously transplanted intact to this new site. I forgot my weariness when I reflected upon the enormous amount of work the women had had to do to bring these new dwellings into being. Hardly had we begun to move forward when we found ourselves surrounded by friends greeting us warmly and showing how pleased they were to see us again, a feeling which was heartily reciprocated. The women hugged and squeezed Norma and gave her affectionate pats of welcome. The chief afforded us a single honor, which we did not expect. He came out to meet us with a present which really touched us, a Fabre tray on which were grains of toasted maize. What he said to me sounded more like a question than his conventional greeting, as though he was anxious to know whether I still harbored any hard feelings. He exclaimed, "Sawadi." My beaming assurance was plain enough confirmation. How could I tell him how much I appreciated a promise kept? How was I to explain? We lay down behind the chief's hut and let sleep slowly engulf us. We had only been resting a moment when we were surrounded by children. They could not understand such immobility. The women brought the sacks of equipment and laid them beside us. The chief solved the problem of having no hut to sleep in. Norma was to sleep with his little nephews and his wives, and I with a brother of Prenaz and his wife. Immediately after supper I went to take my place in the cramped confines of the hut. The savant lay down between his wife and me, and we covered ourselves with mats. In addition, I had with me 2 blankets, which I had made use of, having learned from unpleasant experience how cold it could be at night, but despite my expectations, this particular night turned out to be extremely hot. Prenaz's brother embraced me as a proof that he was my friend, so that the heat and the discomfort became unbearable. I waited for the Indian to go to sleep and gently removed the arm lying across my stomach. When I attempted to push a blanket off me, I woke him up. He murmured that he was my friend and embraced me again more resolutely than before. This went on all night. I think perhaps he had some doubts about my possible intentions toward his wife, from whom I was separated by a few inches. The pale light of dawn found me still awake and still struggling to overcome the unpleasantness of a wretched night. When I compared notes with Norma, I found that she had had a similar experience, and had helplessly to watch the chief's nephews scratching their heads under their long hair, which caused her to feel pretty sure that they must be troubled by parasites. It fell to Norma's lot to lie between one of the women and a child. The child, tempted by the softness of the blanket, was continually trying to put his head under it, and my wife, in the gentlest possible way, tried to prevent the boy from carrying out his dangerous intention. So, one way and another, neither of us managed to get any sleep. Darkness was dispersing from the encampment, and the approach of dawn giving things a certain vague appearance of color. When a group of warriors left the village, there were about 20 of them who, armed, were making their way to the place where the latter of the tribe was to go. They were the scouts. As light became a little stronger, and while the women were finishing the work of assembling the loads that they would carry and the fires were being extinguished, the second armed group set off. A little later this was followed by yet another. We drank some unsweetened tea, seated beside the chief's fire, and we made ready to leave. In accordance with the dictate of the tribe, we would be the last to leave the village because our equipment had to be carried by warriors. The departure had begun so silently that when the chief ordered us to follow him, the tribe was one long line that disappeared into the distance. Ignoring my anxiety about leaving the equipment unattended, not knowing whether anyone was to take charge of it, the chief said laconically, "Let's go." Concealed in a hollow some 15 warriors were waiting. Some of them were of the chief's escort, and some were to look after our luggage. I could not suppress a gesture of appreciation as I asked the warriors to go and pick up our things. I received in reply a look of icy scorn, but hardly had we started off when 5 of them trotted towards the equipment. The cool morning air was an invitation to walking. My only worry was Norma's stamina, so I let her set the pace she chose. The ground, undulating and covered with grass, must have been under water in the rainy season. Even now the steamy earth was wet and our footwear scarcely suitable. We were soaked to the knees by the heavy dew on the grass, which glinted on thousands of spiders' webs, all gleaming with drops of water. The sun was coming up on the left, so I deduced that we were heading south or southeast. We were more or less following the course of the River of the Dead. No sooner did the sun rise and the heat increase than clouds of tiny biting mosquitoes gathered all along the route. I could not defend myself because I was obliged to use my right hand to hang on to the carbine, which had been dismantled in 3 parts, or to steady the knapsack. On the back of my hand there was a large open sore, the result of a simple scratch, and swarms of mosquitoes got into my mouth, eyes, and nose, attracted by the wound. The women were walking slowly. The lofty loads of baskets, bags, and grains, hollowed out tree trunks, which must have weighed around 45 pounds, mats and utensils, taxed their energy and caused them to rest at the side of the column or in the dry shelter of small elevations on which stunted little bushes grew in profusion. We walked behind them for a stretch until the ground enabled us to pass without getting wet in the tall grass. I repeatedly heard voices encouraging Norma. To distract our minds and our stomachs, we hung round our necks some bas-maries containing toasted maize, to which we helped ourselves continually. When we decided to rest, we caused a commotion. All the women, as they came up to us, stopped and advised us to continue walking, for there was still a long way to go. When Norma answered by way of a joke that she would stay behind because she was too tired to go on, their dismay caused them to put down their enormous loads and embrace her, pointing out the danger of staying in that place. They were really alarmed, though we assured them that we would catch them up, but they would not be convinced and declined to budge. So, without having recovered our energy, we were obliged to carry on. When we stopped again for a short rest, we sought the shelter of a thicket in order to stay there unobserved. Walking behind a long line of Indians, which I estimated at some 2 miles in length, had 2 advantages. First, we could follow a definite track, and secondly, we could elude the ticks which teemed in that region. Unfortunately, it was impossible to dodge the swarms of mosquitoes and the boiling temperature, which burned us through our garments and our hats. At first we bathed with water from the canteens, the parts most vulnerable to the effects of the sun, the napes of our necks, our temples, our heads, and shoulders. Later we desisted from this waste of precious water. In a few minutes our shirts were dry again and as stiff as cardboard, and our bodies had become more sensitive than ever. Once before we had been able to undertake the trek through the jungle with all our energies. Now that we were obliged to do the trek without any reserve strength at all, our bodies were resisting. Even today I cannot explain what happened. Maybe the monotony of the territory and the security of relying on a fixed route, or the very weariness that lulled our senses, were to blame. As we reached a patch of low brushwood with a few dried trees, we took a fork to shortcut the path, and as we had done so many times before when we had lost sight of the Indians, and we went on walking. Nothing indicated to me that we had gone wrong, and even when I did not see any Indians, I was not unduly surprised. What did surprise me was that when we came across a depression filled with limpid water, which had accumulated in a great cavern, possibly of subterranean origin, we found no Indians taking advantage of this godsend. I cautiously tasted the water, fearing an excess of alkali or a flavor of some harmful substance, but apart from its brackishness, it apparently contained nothing to render it unfit for drinking. We filled the canteens and had a good wash. It was sheer delight to leave our arms submerged in the water. We found it difficult to resist the temptation to take a bath, but we did not wish to spoil the water for the Indians who would certainly be following us. Ever since Norma had slept with the little nephew of the chief, she had been troubled by the logical dread that some parasites had changed owners. As there was plenty of water to spare and plenty of clayey crevices to contain the liquid, we emptied the canteens into one of them, and Norma washed her hair with disinfectant. It was during this procedure that suddenly I had a presentiment that we had lost our way. With this sensation gripping tight in my chest, I climbed an elevation and looked around in all directions. I could not see a single member of the tribe. It was foolish to move without being sure that we were going the right way. Nevertheless, we had no alternative. The hope that the chief might send some warriors to look for us faded in the face of two questions that they would have to ask themselves. When had we got lost, and at what point of the route? It was certain that they would find us, but how much time would elapse before they did? Days, weeks. Making a calculation based on my recollection of where the sun had been when we were last with the Indians, we decided on a point and went towards it. We had been going forward for more than an hour when suddenly in the distance we saw a dense column of smoke, broad at the base as though from a huge bonfire. I felt reborn. I breathed a great sigh of relief. The tribe was within the farthest limits of my calculations, and fortunately was preparing to set up camp. Another hour went by before our insecure hopes became more certain of fulfillment. As we entered the jungle, we lost sight of the fire, and in a deep gulch, through which flowed a feeble thread of water, we came across the Zavant women. They were all over the place, immune to the smoke and the black ash that were hovering in the air all around. They were taking what rest they could, for no sooner would the fire die down than they would have to build new huts for the night and prepare the food. Worn out, they were reclining in varying attitudes of relaxation. As for us, we followed their example. I tried to draw some water from the gully, but it had become by this time a well-worn path and turned into a mud bath. Moro Pipo, who was on the other side of the gully, made signs to me to go to him. Evidently no one had noticed that we had been lost, and so we said nothing about it. When I reached him, he pointed out at his feet a very thin stream of water which was still clear. We crossed the ravine by sliding down earthy banks as though in a toboggan. On the other side, the grassland which had been green was now a great black patch, smoking and still scattered with burning embers. This was the Zavants' way of clearing harmful insects and animals from the ground which they had chosen for camping. I had to busy myself, assisted by some children, with constructing our dwelling. This time I confined myself to the sort of practical structure favored by the tribe. I cut down 8 erect young trees, which were not easy to find because the Zavant women had availed themselves of all the saplings in the neighborhood, and I planted them in a circle. I bent them together and tied them in the middle so that they inclined inward. Then I placed 2 flexible green branches in position and fastened them all around the outside, and I had a skeleton of arced formation. Later on, I wasted the whole afternoon in my efforts to obtain the elusive palm leaves for covering the hut. It cost me a couple of hunting knives to convince 2 boys that I needed more leaves. Meanwhile, Norma attended the fire. I suppose the mere fact of lighting it fooled us into thinking that we were going to have something to eat. Besides our few remaining beans, as I remember, I did not finish roofing the confounded hut until very late in the evening. I have often read that hunger keeps one awake. In my particular case, weariness eliminated appetite completely. Hardly had I snuggled into my sleeping bag and covered myself over when the adventure which we were living in the fantastic world came to an end, and I returned to the consolations of that world I had voluntarily abandoned. The following day I discovered that the dry firewood I had fetched had been filched. We had no doubt as to who had done this. Opposite us was the open-air camp of the night watch. This was generally composed of young fellows, practical jokers, who used to appropriate, under cover of the night, other people's wood to feed the fire that kept them warm. With firm and deliberate step, Norma went up to the camp, in which several youths were still sleeping, covered over with mats, selected the best of the firewood, and brought it back. The warriors raised no objection and pretended to be asleep. They probably thought it was better not to face up to the just recriminations of an angry woman. We knew that we would be staying there for several days. Pray Na and Moro Pipo told me that the scouts were sure that there was plenty of game. I changed my plan about taking a rest. The savants were going out 6 and 7 at a time, with dozens of spare arrows and great baskets fastened to their heads and shoulders. They were going out hunting. Combining my ethnological interest with that of my stomach, I provided myself with ammunition and went off to the chief's hut. As I was a sort of appendage to his clan, he consented to my accompanying 2 of his sons, Pray Na and Moro Pipo, and 9 other warriors. I said farewell to Norma, who would have given anything to come on the hunt with us, and set out with the Indians. The village was left well guarded by a strong contingent of warriors. The man who led the expedition took a route that lay outside the mass of jungle, skirting it and crossing a confined plain. With rapid, nimble pace, he went forward effortlessly. This was my first experience with a party of warriors, freed from following a pre-established route or of making for a definite place. They walked with great strides, keeping up a harmonious and efficient rhythm. Their bodies inclined slightly forward, heads and chests upright, their attention fixed on the distant underbrush. They were pleased with my company and that I was keeping up with the rapid progress. As for me, my physical and moral troubles had not seemed so light for many a long day, and I was forgetting my own discomfort under the influence of their simple but primordial urge. Every now and then Pray Na cast approving glances in my direction. One of the chief's sons, Pa Ridi, burst into song. No sooner had he uttered the first note than the rest accompanied him with the usual synchronization. Not one voice rose or fell out of keeping with the others, and I was once more carried away by the rapture of that choral precision. It was a song about hunting, and spoke of the feats of some few hunters. When we stopped, the mosquitoes seized their opportunity. The least affected by the attack was myself, on account of my clothing. The savants' naked bodies were riddled with bites. I believe that the paint they use attracts rather than repels these troublesome insects. One warrior scaled the summit of a low hill and explored the region, while the rest, now in complete silence, checked over their arrows. They had brought only tipo arrows, the kind they use for important game. The Indian who was scanning the territory from above uttered a particular kind of shout. As if impelled by a string, the hunting party climbed the rocks to where the watch was standing. I had always thought myself an athlete, but I could not compete in agility and sure-footed nimbleness with the savants. When they reached the top, my hunting companions gazed attentively in one single direction. I did the same, without being able to make out anything but circles of trees and sparsely scattered bushes, rocks, a dazzling stream, pasture, and a kind of canyon of stones and earth from which it seemed the strip of water was flowing. Pray Na came to my assistance. He tugged my arm and whispered, "Po, stags." Suddenly I caught a fleeting vision of a reddish patch against the green. I should never have discovered it by myself. With the greatest excitement, but with marked efficiency, the warriors, their muscles tense at the prospect of imminent action, devised what to my mind seemed a harebrained scheme. They were going to approach the stags, surround them, and drive them towards the cliff. Every place through which they might escape was to be guarded by a hunter. Noiselessly, like red shadows, the Indians glided forward under cover of the vegetation. I thought I would stay on the elevation so as not to confuse a maneuver that called for extreme skill and silence, and also to follow the execution of what I felt sure was a hopeless scheme. I would not have been in doubt if I had had good rifles. I would have gone round the deer, and as soon as they became restless and fled, they would have met the crossfire of concentrated shooting. I watched the bodies of the savants crawling and crouching towards them. One warrior raised himself from the cover of the long grass, and must have shot an arrow. Others followed him. And then at last I did see the animals. There was an incessant hullabaloo of shouting. In great leaps they made for the cliff. I caught sight of the antlers of a large red stag accompanied by 5 does. The savants lost no time. With astonishing speed they rushed towards the animals, allowing them no pause to decide upon any other direction than that of the high bank. They did not pursue them as far as the canyon itself. Just before that they threw themselves on the ground and lay still. The deer and the stag fled in panic. Suddenly they turned sharp round and opened out in a fan-like formation to rejoin each other and change direction once more. For a few seconds they hovered tremulous and uncertain what to do, for on all sides there resounded the shouts of the hunters, except in the direction from which they had been startled at first. They then hurled themselves into a new frantic flight towards the hidden hunters lying in wait in the tall grass. Once more they turned abruptly as they came up against the savants, but this time they were pursued at top speed towards the cliff by one of the hunters, who must have made use of his bow and struck the target, for one of the animals fell to the earth. I left my position and hurried towards the hollow. The deer lay inert, pierced with arrows, but the savants paid no attention to it. The chase was still on. They rushed forward, shouting, or they threw themselves down and hid. On the other side of the hunters were doing the same, and when the stags were confident of having eluded them and approached too close, some warrior would appear suddenly as if shot from a catapult and try to pierce them with arrows. The hours passed and the onslaughts continued without intermission or result. They would not let the animals rest. As soon as they stood still, some hunter would goad them into renewed action. The warriors had sweated so much that no trace of the red paint seemed to remain, and the soil, dust, mud, and wounds caused by branches and repeated falls covered their robust bodies. I could not fire, as I did not know where the rest of the warriors were. The shouts of the savants now underwent a change of tone. They left their post, and all converged on the deer. One of the animals passed close beside an archer, and immediately paid for this with his life. Another came up close to one side of me. I took aim and fired. It went on fleeing in great bounds, but just as I thought I had missed, it fell and lay hidden in the grass. I do not think I can ever remember having heard such an uncontrolled merriment as followed later. 3 large red deer were the reward for the combined physical efforts of the savants, and 1 small bullet. The hunters lost no time in discussion. They lit a big fire, and having skinned one of the deer, they roasted it, or rather they exposed it a little to the heat of the flame and then divided it. I came in for an equal share. I waited until mine was well cooked and had a real banquet, while the savants bathed meticulously in the nearby streams after their meal. They rubbed themselves thoroughly with some soapy bark, and then with a rough leaf they scrubbed off the dirt, rinsing themselves with water from their mouths as they rubbed, as though it were a jet from a tap. As soon as they were satisfied with their cleanliness, they plunged into the water several times. When they came out, they spent some time combing their long hair. Venison is filling and gristly, although it has a very pleasant taste, and one chunk was more than enough to satisfy me. Explorers have attributed to firearms a psychological power over the jungle dweller, which appears to be unfounded. They estimate that they owe their salvation exclusively to the respect which the Indians have for the white man's weapons. The savants never showed any more interest in my carbine than in a box of matches or a boot. They saw it as an integral part of my equipment, but attached no special importance to it. Their code, which has not permitted them to fall into the hands of the whites, makes them believe in their own arms and spurn those of others. To them only savant arrows, savant bows, and savant spears are good. All other weapons have no value. A whole deer had disappeared to satisfy the moderate appetite of 14 men. Some warriors prepared long poles which they stripped, while others tied the feet of the two other animals together with vegetable fiber so as to suspend them from the poles and carry them comfortably between two men, resting the poles on their shoulders. The others were exchanging remarks about the recent chase. I turned to Fabre and asked him in a jovial tone whether it was not more comfortable to hunt with my carbine than to have to lose one's breath. My words met with silent meditation. I was inclined to feel triumphant, thinking that I had stated a practical, incontrovertible truth, and was prepared to expect no answer. Then Fabre asked me in his usual manner, without raising his voice, "Where do you get the arrows from for your bow?" "In my tribe," I replied. "Is your tribe far away?" he asked. "Yes, very far." And then came an example of the logic of the jungle, he said. "Then with your bow you would go very hungry if you had no more arrows. When we need arrows, we have them within reach. We would not want your bow, which has no arrows, and which makes a great noise to warn all the game round about." As he finished, he smiled at me benignly, as if he had just been explaining an easy lesson to a rather backward child. We reached the village after dark. As I passed, I called to Norma, and we went together to the chief's hut. No expression of gratitude issued from the old chief's lip at the sight of the deer meat. Peremptorily, he demanded a bigger fire, and with an eagerness bordering on desperation, he cut a piece of meat and ate it raw. There were some 30 Indians round him. These were those who belonged to the chief's clan. They were waiting for the meat to be distributed. The children were the most impatient. With his machete, the chief became the butcher and hacked at the stags, eating chunks of meat every now and then as he cut. The first pieces were for the children, then his wives, and lastly the wives of his sons and his daughters. The warriors did not approach. Asking for food was a prerogative of the female sex. I noticed with alarm that Norma was not getting any. I mentioned this to the chief, but he, obsessed by the abundance of meat, was paying no attention to words, but only to extended hands. Primitive man, with all his most rudimentary manifestations, held the field that night in the savant camp. When I suggested to Norma that she should imitate the women, her face hardened. She considered that part of the meat belonging to us by right, since I had obtained it myself. There was by now very little of the venison left. The chief was about to cut a shoulder when Norma intervened. She took possession of it by grabbing it as he cut. The old man vacillated for a moment and then prepared to cut off a part of the shoulder. Norma tugged away the whole chunk abruptly. I considered then, and I still consider her action precipitate and even dangerous. With a gesture half of irritation, half approvingly, The Savant chief told her to take it away. As the infamous shoulder of venison was being roasted, my hunger somehow evaporated. I was thinking how near we might have been to death in a surge of Savant rage.